I think people often throw around the statement that we are living in extraordinary times. But I think that this year, that is perhaps an understatement. And as we look at that very powerful video that really takes us back, I think the question that we really want to explore today is what now? What can the democratic community of nations do to make sure that those seeds of democracy, planted literally with the blood and the sweat of thousands, that they bear fruit? We have a really wonderful panel here today to address these issues. I'll go down the line. I won't read their full biographies. They're in your program for you. So first of all, immediately to my right, Sheikh Mohammed Abdullahoum. He's head of the Justice and Building Party in Yemen, which he helped establish just this year. Then next to him is Dr. Radwan Ziadeh, co-founder and executive director of the Syrian Center for Political and Strategic Studies. And then immediately to his right is Mr. David Kramer, president of Freedom House. And then finally, last but not least, Mr. Paul Salem, director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Lebanon. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. I think that we do want to really, this morning, take a very broad view. I think it's important that we start with a nation that has been absolutely at the center of news this past week, and that is Syria. And Dr. Ziadeh, on that point, I would like to start with you. What is your impression of the current situation in your country? How other nations of the world have been responding, and in particular, with the very recent developments of the Free Syrian Army are now increasingly beginning to fight back. What are the concerns that are raised with that?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Let me see. I'm speaking here on behalf, on my capacity as the director of the foreign relations of the Syrian National Council, the SNC, which give me a few minutes, if you can give me a few minutes, a few words about the SNC, because the SNC just founded in October last month, and an umbrella for all the Syrian opposition groups, which does include all the Syrian ethnic groups, Arabs, Kurds, Christian, Alawite, and other groups. But what's more importantly for us, we did not actually found the SNC on the basis what's happened in Iraq on the sectarian basis. We don't actually put the sectarian base as the main base to include everyone, rather than coalition of the different political and social powers and parties, which actually required for every political party to put in its consideration the diversity of the Syrian society in its consideration. This is why we have Kurds and Alawite, but it's not like the Alawite bloc or a Kurds bloc, because that will actually deepen the sectarian language in Syria. Well, this is something we need to avoid. Syria has no history of civil war, and at the same time, all the language of the sectarian has been avoided by all the opposition group. This is why when we hear some comments about it has to be inclusive, it is inclusive and include everyone. As one example, the Kurds as example, they have a certain percent in the Syrian society, but actually they got much more percentage in the Syrian National Council because some activists or actors, they seen themselves as a democratic activist rather than as the Kurdish activist. Back to the situation on the ground in Syria, as you have been seeing that the UN confirmed more than 3,500 have been killed. And we do believe the number is much higher. According to our numbers, more than 5,322 have been killed since March 15. What's unfortunately the international community does not mention too much the political prisoners. The number of the people who have been detained since the uprising is more than 30,000. The Syrian regime canceled the football championship because turned over all the soccer field to be detention centers, like the main stadium in Damascus, in Latakia, in Homs, and the schools. The Syrian regime arrested my brother, my uncle, 3 of my cousins. I have no information about them, just my brother been released last week, and he was actually in the garage of the military airport in Mezza. And more than 220 have been actually killed under torture in prison. This is why we always have concern about our relatives, about family members if they are in prison, we don't know exactly. We will receive them as alive, or be dead, or under huge torture.
Dr. Ziadeh, obviously that's a terrible situation that you personally are dealing with, as are so many of your fellow countrymen. But what is your thought about what the rest of the world has been doing and what they do next?
Yeah, this is actually the question, because in Libya, the international community acted after 11 days, adopted the resolution 1970, which put sanctions on Gaddafi and referred the crimes against humanity to the International Criminal Court. In Syria, it has been 9 months. What the argument here that there is no actually Arab consensus or Arabic support for the actions on Syria like what's happening in Libya. The Arab League does meet 3 times on Syria, and they have the Arab Initiative. And we are the opposition and in supportive of this initiative, which actually put certain conditions for the regime. Of course, the regime did not meet none of them. But more importantly, actually, what the international community is doing. The Security Council failed to adopt any resolution on Syria because the veto being practiced by Russia and China. And I just back yesterday from our visit to Moscow, where we met actually the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs for more than 1 hour. There is no change, unfortunately, in the Russian position. They still repeating the Assad regime propaganda that this is armed gangs killing the people, which nonsense. Let's assume that there is an armed gangs exist in Syria, and those armed gangs are anti-regime groups. Why are killing only anti-regime protesters? It's nonsense. And this is why we think that the international community had the obligation to put all the necessary pressure at the Security Council to adopt resolution. Our main demands now at the Security Council to have international observers, or what's called the blue hat observers. There are other countries has been that, like in Kosovo, in Balkan, and also to refer the crimes against humanity to the International Criminal Court and put sanctions on Bashar al-Assad and other security officers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ziadeh. And on the point of the rest of the world sending in observers, exerting some pressure, I'd like to jump to Yemen, and then I think I want to keep moving to different countries and broadening the scope. Mr. Abdelhaim, UN envoy Jamal Ben-Ammar was in your country yesterday, trying to broker a deal to end the months of protests that have paralyzed your country and get President Saleh to sign on to that Gulf Initiative power transfer deal and step down. What are your thoughts? How is that going? And should the Arab League, do you believe, impose sanctions and suspend Yemen's membership, as it did with Syria and with Libya?
Thank you very much. I think if we look, yes, last year we were here in this room and we were discussing the issue of packages that were coming out of Yemen. We were talking about stalemate in Egypt and the problems and worries of the Arab world. Today we're talking about the hopes of the Arab world and the future of the Arab world. And I think Yemen is in the center, just like everything else in the Arab world. I think today in the Arab world, I'll start with the Arab world in general, the Arab Spring. I think we've seen 3 scenarios in the Arab world. The regular scenario where Tunis, he leaves with not much bloodshed, the bad scenario of Egypt, and then you had the ugly scenario of Libya. And what we're trying to do in Yemen is to avoid the ugly scenario. And I hope that we can look into another scenario in Yemen whereby we will look at a face saving that was proposed by the GCC Council, and that takes us back to the question of Ben Omar. The initiative that was given by the GCC was accepted by the opposition, and the only problem that we've been having is with the president for the last 6 months. He has been saying he will deliver on signing, and he has never signed, and I don't think he will sign. And this is where I think there is a moral duty of the international community. We would like to have a revolution in Yemen, to finish the revolution peacefully. We do not want to see any more repercussions or score settling. So I think what the international can do in Yemen is at least the symbolic assistance or the symbolic gesture to pressure the regime by freezing the assets, banning him from travel and his group, or at least banning the importing of arms that is a result of killing the people. So I think there is a great opportunity, and I can assure you that Yemen is looking forward into a democratic system. Again, it takes us back to the question of democracy. Is this area ready? I think democracy is not a trademark to only one nation or to one culture, but it's rather to everybody. And I think Yemen and the Arab world is eager to live and catch up with the rest of the world. And personally, if you ask me, I think this is the best times that we are living in the Arab world. In the last 50, 60, 70 years, we haven't seen a genuine movement. So yes, in the Arab world, this is the real thing, and I'm optimistic that the Arab world will move forward.
Thank you so much. Before we go to audience questions, which I want to do right away, I would like to also touch on Egypt. Mr. Salah, Mr. Kramer, your thoughts on the current situation there. Obviously, in recent days, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces has proposed those controversial constitutional changes that lead many to believe that they're trying to entrench, really, their hold on power. They're also on the verge of beginning this very, very complicated multi-step election process. So what are your thoughts on what's going on there now, and again, what the rest of the world can and should do?
Well, first of all, I agree with my colleague from Yemen that this is a very hopeful and positive time in the Arab world. Doesn't mean it's not laden with risks and potential for setbacks. And I also look at different countries and try to understand the different trajectories by looking at the level of state development, institutional development, national unity. Egypt is a country with a long history of national unity, a long constitutional history. The modern state has been there at least for 2 centuries. When you compare that to Libya, a very, very different situation. You immediately get very different levels of risk and instability potential in the transitions. On the other hand, you get problems such as the lingering power of the armed forces in Egypt and how that will be managed. To my mind, that's both, in a sense, a positive and a negative. The positive side is that there is a state, there are armed forces at least to maintain stability in a time of great uncertainty and transition, something that is more at risk in Libya, something more at risk in Syria. If and when the regime falls, there will be a more precarious transition. It's very unfortunate, to my mind, that the Supreme Military Council in Egypt has taken such a obfuscating stand, I would say, towards the transition, not committed more positively to a more transparent and rapid transfer of power to civilian authorities. I think the West obviously has a lot of influence with the armed forces, particularly the United States, which is its main financial supporter. The US is perhaps beginning to use more of that influence to keep pushing the armed forces in a positive direction. At the same time, the concerns of many people in the region and outside is the rise of Islamist parties and to what degree or exactly what that will lead to. It is natural that Islamist parties play a big role in a democratic situation in today's Arab world. They are part of the new reality along with other parties. And what I see as a potential positive in the Egyptian and Tunisian situation, which is a bit similar to the Turkish situation, is that it's possible, because of the power of the armed forces, the Islamist parties will cling to democratic institutions as a way to protect themselves from an authoritarian backlash or an authoritarian takeover, a military takeover. So I think this sort of pas de deux, this dance between Muslim Brotherhood and the armed forces and the secular parties, is a very complex one.
Fascinating. I don't want to cut you off, but Mr. Kramer, I would like your thoughts before we then go quickly to the audience.
Let me pick up on this comment that these are better days, and I agree with that.
This optimism, it's refreshing, but is it?
Well, it is. I mean, let's look at the situation. As long as Ben Ali, Mubarak, and Gaddafi were in power, Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya had no hope or possibility of moving in a democratic direction. As long as Assad remains in Syria, as long as Saleh remains in Yemen, these leaders are a major obstacle for these countries to move in a more democratic direction. Their removal by no means guarantees that these countries will become democratic, but they, for the first time in decades, give these countries the hope and possibility of moving in a more democratic direction. It troubles me when people say the easy part was getting rid of these leaders. If it was so easy, it wouldn't have taken 30, 40 years for this to have happened.
Well, it's not that it's easy, it's just the first step.
It's the first step, but often you hear the commentary that it's easy to get rid of these leaders. The hard part comes next of how do you govern. Certainly the hard part is coming next. But it was not easy to remove these leaders. Moreover, the removal of these leaders has come at the loss of a considerable number of lives.
Certainly.
And we have to remember the sacrifices that have been made. But I think there's no question that these countries now, for the first time, have the possibility of moving in a positive direction. In Tunisia, you saw not the military takeover, but a civilian authority takeover. And I think that's why there is more promise in Tunisia, including with an election that was conducted that most observers deemed to have passed the test. In Egypt, you have the military, essentially, that has been in power for 5 decades, if not longer, continuing to stay in power through the SCAF, and I think that's why Egypt has had more difficulty. Libya is a bit more of a chaotic situation, essentially starting from scratch, but I think in Libya too there is the possibility with Gaddafi no longer on the scene that Libya too can move in a more positive direction.
So each situation is so very different. In reality, we aren't really dealing with the Arab Spring. I think it's safe to say they are the Arab Springs.
And what's also important is what's happened in these countries has chipped away at the myth that the Muslim world or the Arab world is not interested in freedoms. The desire to live in a free society is universal in nature. Who doesn't want to be able to associate with whatever groups they want, speak out, practice whatever religion they believe in? This is a universal desire. It's not a Western desire or any other desire. It's universal in nature, and it includes countries that we're not talking about, North Koreans, Burmese, Cubans, you name it. It's universal to want to live in a free society.
Thank you. Let's now go to the audience for questions. And if you would, please identify yourself. And if you also have someone you would like to direct your question to, if you would. We have a question right here in the front.
Shlomo Avineri, Israel. The Arab Spring has been compared to what happened in Central Eastern Europe 1989, 1990, where a number of regimes disappeared, and alternatives were put up. And I think what we can learn from that is that while 1989, 1990 Eastern Europe was uniform, the outcome was not. We have Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary being consolidated democracies with a market economy, and we have Russia and Ukraine, which are very different. So we have, as Mr. Salem said, to look at one country at a time and the histories and traditions of that country. And this brings me to the following question. Can the panel give us some idea about the chances or the dangers that the military eventually will continue to be in power? In Egypt, this is pretty obvious a possibility. Even in Libya, which is a very confused situation, we have in Tripoli the head of the military committee being really much more in power than the TRC, which is still in Benghazi. So given the tradition of military rules in Arab societies, do we have some good guarantees as what we're going to see in the future is not a continuation of some sort of military rule, which may also be the case in a different way in Iraq, where we see a neo-authoritarian, Shiite, but a neo-authoritarian system. Can you reassure us that this is not going to happen?
Well, I don't think anybody can give guarantees, but just to make a few comments. First of all, comparing Central and Eastern Europe to what happened in the Arab world, there are a number of parallels, a number of differences. In the Arab world, the regimes didn't collapse, but these were massive revolutions in each country, and the regimes at great distress eventually fell. So I think there's much more of a sort of a public empowerment from the beginning. Secondly, it was a very the Arab societies in most cases already had fairly open economies. Some of them already had civil societies that were active, when you take Egypt and some other, Yemen, for example, whereas perhaps the Soviet bloc was more, in some cases, much more isolated economically and in terms of civil society. Having said that, I don't think that one can exactly draw lessons from one region to another, except that to say, as you re-emphasized, each case will find its own way. I think the main challenges facing the Arab countries that are moving towards transition, one obvious one is how will the new Islamist parties evolve? What lessons will they draw from the Turkish experience? How will they deal with their own rise to power? I've been very encouraged that Ennahda party in Tunisia and the Muslim Brotherhood are pointing at least in the right direction, to say that we understand this revolution was a pluralist revolution. It included many other groups other than us. The mandate is not a mandate for Islamist parties to rule alone. The people have spoken out for the rule of the people, not the rule of God. The fact that Tunisia has been leading in revolution and has been leading in transition, to my mind, is a good sign. Tunisia is the most likely to succeed. Tunisia is also the most likely to find a reasonable balance between an Islamist party and other balances.
Mr. Salam, thank you.
Yeah.
The other panelists are very interested in chiming in. So, Dr. Ziadeh, should we go to you next?
Yes, I like always the comparison between the Eastern Europe and the Arab Spring. This is why I called always the fifth wave of democratization in the region. It's even that it's much more difficult. We don't have. What's missing in the Arab Spring, the regional institution, where actually the European Union played a crucial role actually in Eastern Europe. The Arab League is not playing the same role. We don't have actually a set of principles in the Arab League to be in transformation of the democratic. That the Arab League is acting on Libya in different ways rather than in Syria. The Arab League was silent on Bahrain. And this is why all these questions has been raised actually on the role of the regional institutions. What is actually the role of the army? In the beginning, actually, the role of the army was a key role in Tunisia, Egypt, and in other countries, where actually Tunisia played the most useful role, where then, of course, you have other factors. You have strong middle class. 20% of the population has Facebook account. This is what a very prominent transformation in Tunisia. But the army in Egypt not playing the same role. In Syria is much more difficult, where actually you have one of the largest army regarding the size, 400,000, and the Assad regime is using the full capacity of the army, putting siege, open fire on the protesters. This is why it's maybe Syria on the brink to have civil conflict with using all of the capacity of the army. But how to deal actually with the army after the revolution, this is the key question. And we have seen that in Libya and in Egypt after that.
Mr. Abdulrahman?
Thank you. I think just to go back to the...
Stand over here so you don't have to talk to my...
Yeah. To go back to the question of the army, the Arab world is seeing something new. If you look at the change in the 50s, 60s, 70s, whereby you would have coup d'etats by the military here and there, and you would have the socialists taking over or the Islamists trying to take over, it never did work. We've tried it, it failed. Today, we're seeing something really new. When you see millions of people on the street, staying on the street for months and months, determined peacefully for a transfer of power, asking for freedom, asking for democracy. So I have that faith and I have that trust on those youth and the young men that are on the streets all this time. They will reach what they want. And to go back to the army, I think we should look at the army, especially in Yemen and maybe in Syria as well. Let's work with the army and let them feel they are part of the change. The change is to include them. As long as we try to reach with the message that this revolution is about reconciliation, about forgiveness, about moving forward and no score settling. That's the most important thing that we have to assure. And let's not give the military a position whereby they would stand and fight till the end. We have to work with them in order to reach that change. And I think there is a big responsibility and a moral responsibility from the international community and mainly the US. Have that faith in the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring will bridge the gaps of the misunderstanding that we've been having. So I think this is a new opportunity and a new time. And here today, I take this opportunity to thank Senator McCain for his support in Yemen and in Syria and other parts of the Arab world for supporting the Arab Spring. And I do ask him and his colleagues in Congress and in the international community, the Western world, to really look at this Arab world as a new Arab world that is willing to work with you. Of course, there are those questions that might arise from the international community. Will the new regimes work with us on fighting Al-Qaeda, on fighting radicalism? Will they work on the region to secure interest and stability? I can guarantee you we will work on fighting Al-Qaeda. We will work on fighting radical groups. We will ensure that piracy, we will fight piracy. All what we need is your support and be with us for this change. Change is going to happen, especially when you look at Yemen. It will happen. But the question we're asking ourselves, what price will we have to pay? Can we have a transfer of power peacefully with less bloodshed? Or will we have the Libyan scenario? I hope we do not reach the Libyan scenario, and I hope that there is the seriousness from the West to really understand what's going on and work together for a better future.
Mr. Kramer, very briefly, before we go to our next question, which will be right here if we want to go ahead and arrange the mic.
Appreciating that all these countries are unique and regions are different, I think it is useful to differentiate between East Central Europe and the former Soviet Union. In Central Europe, you've had parliamentary systems largely evolve, which means you don't have the replacement of one strongman by another. You've had the attraction of the European Union and NATO for these countries to join. You've had the opportunity for them to point at the Russians or the Soviet Union and say they were responsible for imposing the system on us. You've also had the security services and the army not play a major role in Central Europe. If you look at the former Soviet Union, you've had Russia in particular, as you cited as a good example, rigged elections where it's decided before the voters go to the polls, strong presidential systems, security services playing an abusive role, the media are clamped down, human rights are abused, all of these problems exist. And so if we are to look for lessons learned, moving toward a more parliamentary system of government, I think, is the way to go, and also trying to get the military and the security services out of politics and out of governing and have accountable civilian control. That's really, I think, the best way for these countries to solidify their democratic credentials.
Thank you very much. And our next question, right here.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. My name is Mohammed Shtay. I'm from Palestine. I would like to make a few points. First of all, I think it's very early to draw conclusions. The situation is very fluid. I'm very worried about democracy. My main concern is that when Islamic parties, they get into the democratic process, it becomes disposable democracy. They use it for once, and that's very worrying. The other important point is what we have to witness new alliances emerging in the region. The Islamists and the army, both of them are not interested in handing power over to democratic forces. My main concern is who are the winners and who are the losers. The losers we have to be careful about the losers so that we might not have a counter-revolution to exactly what is happening today. My question to the panel is, are you aware of the forces for counter-revolution? Are you aware of where the region are heading? I know one important thing, that the region will never be the same. Thank you.
Thank you. Could just maybe one of you take that so we can go to lots of questions.
Yes. I think sometimes we do exaggerate about the power of the religious parties or the Islamists. I think in the last 20 years, they functioned well because they were working underground and they were the only ones that were really interested. People were losing faith in democracy. Today, let's not exaggerate the strength of the religious parties. If you look at the masses on the street, whether in Egypt, whether in Yemen or in Syria or in Tunis, those are not all, the millions are only Muslims groups. The nation is moving. The Muslims have adapted to the new game of democracy, and they will work within the democratic system. If they don't, the street is always there. Those people that are giving their lives and giving everything they have for democracy will not give this revolution to an Islamic or to a military alliance. So I can assure you this is not something to worry about. And today, if you ask any Islamist in the Arab world, he will tell you we would like to see a Turkish model, and we would not like to see a Taliban model anymore. So I can assure that this is where these revolutions are moving. And the most important thing is these Islamists, let's not fear them. Work with them until we hear something else from them. If they are not sincere and genuine about democracy, then everything can be re-evaluated, and the people are there. And those that stood for this revolution will continue forward.
Dr. Ziadeh, something briefly.
I think it's important not to fall in the trap of the authoritarian regimes in the region when they are repeating that the only alternative of us is the Islamist. You remember that the last interview of Mubarak was the Muslim Brothers will take over. And Gaddafi, he said Al-Qaeda will take over. And I think that the authoritarian regimes in the region played on that. The only alternative of us is the Islamists. Well, this is not true. They actually look to the Tunisia. If that's true that Al-Nahda party take 90 seats, but all other secular parties, they get actually more than 72 seats, are liberals, leftists, and nationalists. That means they still have actually their role to play, and why Al-Nahda consider actually reconciliation and negotiation with others. That with the same time, maybe Al-Nahda has more, we have to understand the election in Tunisia, that the Tunisian actually voted for everyone, played an important role against Ben Ali. Everyone actually was anti-Ali being actually elected. And this is why an important notice to understand. And regarding in Egypt and Syria, the Islamists are actually different fractions and different trends. And I don't think that the Muslim brothers in Syria, they have the much role that like they have in Egypt. Always the regime actually exaggerating the role of the Muslim brothers, but the Muslim brothers banned in Syria since 1982, and they don't have any role inside the country. But that doesn't mean, of course, in the future they play a role with others, but not the only one.
Thank you. And our next question is up here.
Nadim Houri from Human Rights Watch, based in Lebanon. Couple of comments / questions. I agree, I share the panelist assessment that this is a very hopeful time, but I also think we need to recognize that we're sort of entering a new stage in the Arab Spring with sort of new obstacles, and I really see two main challenges. One, I think there is some sort of counter-revolutionary forces at play, particularly when it comes to sort of finances. We're getting more and more information about, for example, the role that the Qataris have been doing in terms of sending money to Islamist movements. And I think that's a real question for us to think about. I mean, is it a fair fight today between the sort of liberals and the Islamists? I agree the Islamists have the advantage of organization that's gone for a long time. It's their fair chance, and I think they can use it. But I also think there are things, they're not exactly, the institutions of monitoring the elections are not yet up to speed, particularly when it comes to financial control. So it'd be very interesting to explore that more, and I'd be interested to hear if you have any information on what's been happening, particularly that the Egyptian elections are going to be soon. The second question I have, and I see that as sort of being the second biggest challenge right now, particularly in situations that are taking time. Yemen, Bahrain, because I think the crisis is ongoing, and obviously Syria. Once you get out of North Africa, the composition of these societies is a lot more complex. And as it takes longer, there's a vacuum and there's a desire for regional powers to try to fill that vacuum. We see that most clearly in Syria. And my big concern today is seeing Syria shift from a popular uprising to a situation of a regional proxy conflict. And we already sort of see that with Saudi and other Arab countries using that to score points against Iran, and Iran trying to protect its vested interest and somehow instrumentalizing what has been an amazing popular uprising. So that's sort of the second challenge that I just wanted to flag.
Thank you. Mr. Salam?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are certainly huge risks and major challenges moving forward, despite the positive dynamic of tens of millions of people standing up for freedom and for good governance and so on. One set of problems is collapsing while transitioning. Countries like Egypt and Tunisia have very low risk of collapsing while transitioning, whereas countries like Libya or Syria or Yemen have that risk to varying degrees. So there is a risk of collapsing into failed state or civil war of different. That's a major, major risk, which has huge security repercussions. Refugee issues could come out of it. I'm not terribly concerned about competition post-transition. In other words, yes, it's significant that the Qataris perhaps are financing Islamists, and perhaps that's bad and so on. But I have trust that if a country makes it to a competitive electoral transition and the people really have a say in choosing and holding parties accountable, I think that mechanism itself has enough safeguards in it. The main concern that I have post-transition is two levels of failure. One might be simply the failure of the post-transitional system to deliver governance. Parliamentary systems, I fully agree, are much more inclusive, much less liable to reproduce the authoritarian patterns, but in some cases, the governance could be complicated, slow decision-making and so on, and the level of frustration of the people could become very high, and there could be a backlash. The second level of very high risk is economic failure. These revolutions, a big part of them was because of unemployment and social injustice and lack of growth. None of the Arab economies have high productivity and high job growth. Certainly countries like Egypt have a big problem at that level. And as my colleague Dr. Ziadi mentioned, these This democratic transformation is happening at a time without serious economic assistance. Western Europe after World War II had the Marshall Plan. Central and Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall had the EU standing by. These are taking place at a time of a global financial crisis. So my main concern, 4 or 5 years down the road, people would have tried democracy, the economies might have failed, and they will begin to turn to something else. And that's where I begin to worry about some military officer can say, as in Weimar Germany, or so, that these politicians, you've tried democracy, it doesn't work, the economy is failing. Either an Islamist could step forward or a military officer or some. That's where my concerns lie. Unfortunately, the West cannot do much for the economies at this point, but definitely the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, could do much more. The West could probably encourage them or push them to do much more.
Mr. Kramer, in reality, I mean, as was just pointed out, what can the Western countries, Western Europe, the United States, to be so many who are struggling with their own economic problems, and then you have the issue of capital flight from these countries. Egypt, you know, the Arab world pulling so much of its cash out. What can we do?
Well, I think Paul's right that given the economic crisis that Europe is facing, the challenges in the United States, the economy, there isn't going to be a huge economic assistance package. And so we shouldn't even build up expectations that there will be, because then we won't meet those expectations and it will lead to greater frustration. I think it's very important, though. The United States provides $1.3 billion in assistance to the Egyptian military. It seems to me we are not using that for leverage to tell the SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, that a number of the steps that they've taken are actually going in the wrong direction. And particularly with members of Congress here, the sense I've gotten in talking to some staff is that patience on the Hill is starting to wear thin with the Egyptian military. The treatment of NGOs, not just foreign NGOs, including my own, but domestic NGOs. And the continuation of the emergency rule is another issue. It seems to me that we already provide Egypt with $1.3 billion. We should be making better use of that assistance by saying this is not a free check that's going to keep coming if you continue to go down the path that you are. But just very quickly, if I can, on the issue of parties. The concern in Egypt, remember, initially was that the SCAF was moving too quickly, that there were going to be elections and the Muslim Brotherhood was going to take over. Now the concern is the process is taking too long. But in that time, I have not gotten the impression that the more liberal, reform-minded parties have made good use of this extended period of time. They do not start from the same point. The Muslim Brotherhood, just like with Hamas in the West, in the Gaza Strip, have these social networks in place that provide for the populations that engender more support for them. And so when they engage in the political process, they're likely to do much better. The more liberal, reform-minded parties just can't seem to get their act together, bicker among themselves a lot. Certainly are not being helped by the authorities. They're being handicapped by the authorities. But they do need to be more effective as a political organization in mobilizing support and getting outside of the capitals of their countries.
Thank you. And our next question is right up here. Gentlemen.
I'm Brian Catoulis with the Center for American Progress. My question was going to be on the economy, and you largely answered it. The one tool that I think we have as Western societies that we've used in the Middle East is security assistance, and you talked about this in the case of Egypt. How do we need to better integrate and transform the way that we cooperate with the militaries and the intelligence agencies of these governments? Because we often, as democracy promotion supporters, look at political parties, civil society, and other things. How would you recommend, say, Canada's government or the US to try to reshape its relationships with the militaries of the region to help bring about sort of pragmatic reform in these societies?
Mr. Abdullah?
Yeah, thank you. I think the question of the economy is very essential and important. And if we just look at two comparisons, I think if we compare the achievements in Afghanistan and in Iraq and compare it to Tunis and Egypt, I think one can draw the conclusion and the cost and the time. The other thing is we have to be patient with these revolutions. Revolutions take time. There is no such a thing as an express revolution whereby you will get results overnight. We need time until we see things moving. And the most important challenge, there are a lot of potentials in the Arab world. Corruption is a major issue in the Arab world. When you tell me that there isn't wealth, there is enough wealth in the Arab world. If you look at leaders that are worth 15 billion, leaders that are worth 35, 40 billion. So there is a lot of corruption. This is one of the things. Revolution is not just to get rid of a regime, but rather to build a new hope, a new economy, a new life. And this is where the challenge is, and this is where the assistance of the international community has to come in and help in building these new regimes and helping in the transitional period of having a real institutions that can move forward and face these challenges.
Anyone else want to chime in on that?
Just on the question about Syria becoming a proxy of the regional power. Actually, the Syrian crisis is actually a key question about the role of Iran. And we do believe that this is an important question which unfortunately many Western countries, they don't understand that actually the interest and the values of the change in Syria, the interest of the values of the West actually in changing the regime in Syria. Because if you need actually making Syria away of Iran, you have to change the Assad regime. If you have to bring stability into Lebanon or in Iraq, you have to change the Assad regime. If you have, because the Syrian foreign policy depends actually on the last 4 decades on making troubles on the neighbors. Egypt depends on its history, Saudi Arabia depends on its money, and Syria depends on making troubles on the region. This is why you have to change in the Assad regime to be more responsible and making the stability in the country. Iran from the day one actually backing the Assad regime financially and technically, even that sending some experts. And there is credible reports about some snipers coming from Iran to shoot Syrians in Jisr al-Shaghur and in Homs and other areas. And the vote actually, at the last vote at the Arab League, where actually 19 Arab member states supported the suspension of the Syria from the Arab League, and only Lebanon and Iraq and Yemen, Lebanon and Iraq vote no, Lebanon and Yemen voted no, and Iraq is abstaining. That means there is nothing in Iraq. There is no U.S. influence in Iraq. That means there is an axis emerging between Iran, Iraq, and Hezbollah, which governing Lebanon right now. This is why it's important. If the U.S. now, the Obama administration put actually combating Iran as a priority, and the nuclear program of Iran, it's as a priority. But actually changing the Assad regime will weaken Iran in the region. Well, this is something I think it's important. I think that the United States and the West have to understand that it's in changing the Assad regime will not fall to the civil war, rather than making Iran much more weaker and making the region much more stable.
Brief follow-up before we go to a question.
Just a very quick point, and I thought the previous panel very eloquently touched on the challenges of how to respond. There's a tricky balance between avoiding raising expectations of Syrians or Yemenis or others so that they don't think that international community is going to come riding to their rescue. That and telling the repressive, abusive authorities in these countries, you have a green light because we are not going to intervene. We should not be telling them our plans and telegraphing these things. Let them be uncertain. Let them wonder what we might do. Let them think the United States is crazy and we might do some things. I don't have any problems with that.
Okay.
I don't think we responded to the gentleman's question just briefly about the military and military assistance. I think there are two levels. There's the political and there's sort of the capacity building or capacity changing. In a country like Egypt in particular, as my colleague said, it's perhaps a political role of talking the military down from a position that they're at. And that has a lot to do with their own concerns about their own future, their place in the post-democratic order. I think the US has a big role to play. Turkey has a big role to play. Turkey has had these problems of the military and a democratic system. It took a long time for them to work through them. Turkey has a lot of credibility in the region. I think they could play an important role. Egypt,
I mean, it seems it's now stepping up to the plate. What do you think about what has happened in recent days?
Indeed. I mean, I think the Turkish role has been, in the beginning, they stumbled a lot in their positions, but I think it's a very important role. Usually we talk about the democratic aspect and so on, but I think the way, after 4 decades, they're beginning to resolve the issue of the military. It's not exactly a model to follow because they went through very difficult times. But in other words, when addressing the political side of the future of the military, particularly in Egypt, they are very panicky and they're very concerned and they look at things in a black and white way. They should be reassured that they do have a role, but that role has to be limited and they have to be talked down. On the other side, there are countries like Libya or a post-Assad Syria or a post-Saleh Yemen, where the armed forces and the internal security forces might have to be built up in some cases from scratch. Libya has the money to pay for it, but needs the technical assistance. Post-Assad Syria, I'm sure the Assad regime, if it falls, is going to take much of the armed forces and institutions with it. There's going to be a great need for institution building in the armed forces, internal security, as well as training them to be armed forces and intelligence services and policing services now in a democratic state, changing the habits of those armed forces as authoritarian instruments.
Who should do that training?
Well, if there were more players in the region who could do that ably, and again, perhaps Turkey is an example, that would be preferable, but most armed forces in the Arab world in non-transitioning countries are authoritarian. So not much help there. So I guess it does fall to assistance in some cases from the West, but Turkey and perhaps others can help out.
Thank you. Next question here, Ray.
Is it on? Yes.
Now you are.
Christoph von Marschall, U.S. correspondent of the German daily Der Tagesspiegel. We started to focus on the political developments, participation. Then I was very happy that the word economic development came up, but we left it too quickly, I think, without answering really this challenge. There's a certain historical pattern. I mean, participation is important, but what the outcome of revolutions is normally decided whether the moderate governments after revolution can deliver economic progress or not. People don't vote in the first run for the radicals, but after 1, 2, 3 years, if they can't deliver economic progress, and then we end up with Bolshevists in Russia, with Mullah regime in Tehran, and so on and so on. So especially the people who are from the region, how do you address this important issue? It's not only about the euro crisis and the debt crisis in the US. It is also the demographic situation in these countries, which makes it extremely difficult to deliver economic progress and meet the expectations of the people. So for me, this is really the most important issue. How do you address that? How can you generate that from the inside? And I'm aware that we are in a first phase where first participation and political things are important, but in the longer run, the economic question is a more important one. And maybe a provocative question, is a strong role of a military maybe a good fallback insurance against this kind of things?
Gentlemen, who wants to take this one?
Just on the economic question, actually, I see more opportunities actually in the change in the region for more economic opportunities rather than before. I just back from Rome, Italy, where actually they have now tens of contracts with the Libyan. And at the same time, the Tunisian, they are very happy with changing of Libya because they have high percentage of unemployment, which make troubles for the democratic, new democratic government in Tunisia. But with all the opportunities in Libya, that make the situation much easier. I think that now we have more economic opportunities in Tunisia, in Libya, and in Egypt, because one of the main issues which those authoritarian regimes are very corrupted, became actually the president himself, along with his nephews, became dominated the whole economy. And this is why when we have more transparency and more support from the West, from the Europeans and from the United States about that, I see that more opportunities for the economy.
Mr. Abelahum?
Thank you. I think this is a very important question, the economy. I think the Arab world in general and Yemen in particular, I think we're way down there in the basement. There is no way but up from here. So if you look at Yemen, for example, where the per capita income of an individual is between $500 and $600 a year, and up north, you're talking about 30, 40, 50, 60, 70,000. I don't think this is right. I think there is a room for reform. There is a room for economy and inter-economy assurances within the area. And I think the future is bright. But the most important thing is that to have that faith and trust in building these economies and working with these economies. And I'm sure that the assistance, when we say the assistance from the international community, we don't want the handouts, but rather in building these institutions and having that trust. This part of the world would like to be a reliable partner for the future, and we would like to be or to feel that we are serious about the challenges that are facing the international community.
How do you convince them, though? Because money doesn't like risk.
Of course, money doesn't like risk, but always money can always avoid risks and avoid challenges. And I think if you look in the area where sometimes certain investment has to be made, if you look at Yemen, if you look at Syria, these are the challenges that we have to pose and we have to face. And I think as an assurance for the Gulf states, especially that they have the money, and I think they need the inter-partnership with a country like Yemen or Syria or others. And in the end, we have to complement each other. I mean, a revolution in Yemen does not mean it's going to move up north to the Gulf states or any other area, but rather we need their assistance. And I think Yemen needs the Gulf states more than the Gulf states need Yemen. So this is where we have to complement each other in order to see stability in that region.
Thank you. And our next question is right here.
Is this on?
Now it is.
Jonathan Tepperman from Foreign Affairs Magazine. Since I work for a foreign policy publication, I want to ask a foreign policy-related question. And let's assume for a minute that the democratic transitions in these countries all go forward. The question is, what will the foreign policies of these countries look like? The reason I ask is, for many years, one of the reasons the West supported Arab autocracies is because they were very cooperative. And of course, the reason that the United States continues to support Arab autocracies in the Gulf in particular is because they continue to be cooperative. When I was in Egypt in the spring, one thing that everyone could agree on, members of the opposition, is that we will no longer play the role of doing whatever the United States tells us to do, and that our relationships with Israel will change, our relationship with Iran will change. The question is simply, what will a more democratic Middle East look like in terms of relations with the West and in terms of relations with each other? Thank you.
And Israel, very big question. Yes.
Well, I think, the foreign policies of many of these countries can be discerned. Obviously, they're based on their interests. For many of these countries, there will not be a dramatic change in foreign policy. If you look at Tunisia or Egypt and probably Yemen, their interest in their economic relations with Gulf countries, with the global economy, which includes the US and Europe, but also includes Russia and China and India and other partners. For many of these countries, the US remains the only strategic provider in real terms. At the same time, however, the process of politics will become much more political and much more nationalistic. And that's already obvious in the case of Egypt, where, of course, they've come out quite clearly, including the Muslim Brotherhood, that they will keep the peace treaty with Israel because that's based on their reading of Egypt's interests, but they will have a tougher position, a more nationalistic, more popular position vis-a-vis some of Israel's policies. In a sense, their foreign policy will be similar to where Turkish foreign policy is, which is sort of pragmatic, rational, but also nationalistic and tough, and not dependent so much on foreign diktat. The fact that there's more public accountability compared to what was previously means that leaders will be less amenable to foreign influence. Mubarak was more under the influence of the US than any new leader in Egypt. Bashar al-Assad is more under the influence of Iran than somebody who has domestic political support. The game changer, I think, in all of this could be Syria, because Syria has an exceptionally close relationship with Iran, and it's possible that a new post-Assad Syria might align itself quite differently in the region. Might not break its relations with Iran, but I would expect it probably to park closer to Turkey, to the Arab position, and maintain relations with Iran, but no longer be Iran's strategic ally in the region. That would completely change sort of the pattern of power in the region. It would completely alter Hezbollah's strategic environment and leave it much more vulnerable. So I think that could be a big game changer.
Anyone else? Dr. Ziadeh?
Yeah, this is actually a key question. It wasn't very important in Tunisia since Zain Abidine Ben Ali has no much role in foreign policy, but it's actually the weight in Syria, where too much invested in the foreign policy in the Mashriq countries. I totally agree with my friend Bo regarding there is actually a quite strong public opinion against Iran and Hezbollah. they're burning the Iranian flags, the Ahmadinejad photos in the street, because not only backing the regime, because also for different reasons. I think the foreign policy in Syria back to the 50s, it's seen itself as a part of the Arab nations. And this is why it's always the Syrians repeat that Syria is the beating heart of the Arab world. And much seen itself with closer to Saudi Arabia, Egypt, that's such kind of access. When the Assad regime trying actually to be much more closer to Iran, that make a lot of frustrations among the Syrians and the Arabs. But also regarding that the relationship with the United States and the West. And this is much concern of the Russians about that, because Syria, it's the only Mediterranean country, they have still strong relationship with the Russia. If they lost that they lost their presence in the Mediterranean. I think it's more than 60% of the graduate students and professors in the Syrian universities are graduated from the Soviet Union. And now there is big change will be actually the Syrians looking to the West, to the US universities, to have much more opportunities in Europe and the United States. And this is why, as I said, Russia, they have concern. But at the same time, we are repeat that we are looking for good relationships with all the neighbor, depends on actually on the sovereignty of our country, and depends on the interests of the Syrians.
And briefly, Mr. Abalhum, we have so many questions in the queue.
I think the straightforward answer to this question is, look at the 9 months or the 10 months that started the revolution in the Arab world. We have not seen a single demonstration against the US, but rather everybody would like to work with the US. If you look in Yemen, just have a minute, all the political parties, when we're talking about the peace, the GCC initiative, everybody is working with the US in order to achieve that settlement or safe transfer of power. So I think this is a great opportunity, and I think we should build on this. And I'm optimistic that the new relationship between Yemen or the Arab world and the West will be a positive one in the coming years. How do we keep maintaining it? This is the question and the challenge we will have to face.
Thank you. And our next question is right here.
Thank you. It's Rafat Al-Khali from Yemen. Just three quick points. The first one is about the sort of the post-transitional period, and how do we try to ensure that it doesn't maybe fall in the wrong hands, or ensure that it's a better outcome. I think there's a lot that the international community can do in terms of using soft power. Because I'll speak about Yemen. The presence there, the diplomatic presence, is very strong and very influential. Rather than specifically influencing or dictating what the outcome of the period should be, there's a lot that can be done to influence the process itself. If we ensure that the process is as inclusive as possible and is not only dictated by the few elites, we could call them, who might or might not want to have this democratic and inclusive process. If we open that up, and if we make sure that everyone is represented in shaping the next constitution or whatever the next transitional period is going to entail, that is one big way that we can all help each other in shaping the coming period.
Did you have a question?
No, just a quick point on the economy. Following on what Anne-Marie was saying yesterday, I think there's a lot that can be done regionally in terms of something similar to the Marshall Plan from the GCC Council. Because there can be easily preferential treatment or preferential laws to Yemen, and even in terms of employment, in terms of exports, and that can help the economy immensely, rather than just giving out aid, for example. So that's just the 2 points.
Thank you very much. And gentleman right here.
My name is Song from South Korea. I'd like to touch on some correlation between democracy and economic growth in that region, based on the experience of my country. In 1960, my country's per capita income was $80 actually. And then from then on, we have been urged by many Western countries that we have to go ahead in democratic progress. But to our experience, we need some long fermenting period for democracy. Without some increase in the per capita income and social and economic development, you can hardly expect all of a sudden a democratic process. With that background, my point of the question is, I like to ask the local view. Nowadays, Americans and European countries are spending a lot of military assistance as well as development assistance, but these assistances are not well coordinated. The point is, you have to train and educate young people and make them equipped with some technology training abilities combined with some job appointment. Job appointment cannot be coming all of a sudden. Some developed countries should provide job opportunity as well by some administrative or regulatory assistance from government sectors in donor countries in cooperation with private sectors. How do you view of this kind of direction for coordinating democratic processes and economic growth?
David, you want to take this?
It's obviously critically important that after revolution, when these kinds of leaders are removed, that these countries move in a more advanced direction economically, because the last thing any of us would want is for Tunisians or Egyptians, Libyans to wish that the old days were back because they lived better lives. So it's very important to help these countries economically. But let me also be clear that the kinds of leaders that these countries had were terribly corrupt. You think of the billions of dollars that Gaddafi and Mubarak and Ben Ali absconded. These countries do have the ability to get on their feet economically. The problem was that these leaders treated these economies as their own personal trust fund. And when you have accountable governments, if they engage in corruption, this isn't true everywhere, but more often than not, those leaders are replaced, or they're brought to trial or court. And so I think it's critically important that these two move hand in hand, that you do want to see democratic governments or transitional governments advance their economies, but it's also critically important that you have accountability, and accountability comes from democratically elected governments that are accountable to the populations. So there's no cure, there's no magic to improving these economies. A lot of what these countries can do is already there, it just hasn't been used appropriately.
If I may, I mean, obviously there's more than one path to prosperity and more than one path to getting to the other end of a democratic and a prosperous nation. Indeed, many of the Arab states pointed to East Asia before the revolutions to say that in the first phase of development, it's economic to get to the stage where we want to get to, it's better to have semi-authoritarian governments provide stability and security and achieve economic growth. The problem was one of corruption and one of policy as well. I mean, whereas China in the last 20 years has succeeded in achieving spectacular economic growth, South Korea already in previous decades, probably because of much better policy and much wiser leadership, the leaders in the Arab world who were claiming this very argument that we will get to democracy later once we get to a certain level of economic development, they didn't do that. Now, the reality is here we are. In many of these countries, we're going to have some kind of electoral democracy, and we're going to have economic challenges. I'll say 2 points about that. First of all, I think it's clear there is going to be disappointment. So us in the Arab countries and the ones that we have to prepare ourselves, like in a relationship, for the first disappointment. We have to get beyond that. That's going to be challenging, definitely, because things are not going to be fixed by the next election. The second thing is that the economic policies that need to be put in place are the key to attracting investment. The region is awash with capital. We don't need capital from Europe or the United States. There's tons of it in the GCC. There's huge markets as well as investors from China all the way across the board. The problem has been in these countries is poor policy and poor governance of market systems, of labor markets, of many of the basics of economics. There's a lot of work currently being done among parties that are soon moving into power about exactly how to adjust policies to achieve particularly job-rich growth. Egypt had growth, Tunisia had growth, but it wasn't creating jobs.
Okay, and a question back here.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the Israeli position of toward the Arab Spring, because we've heard lots of discouraging comments during the Egyptian revolution. That was mainly because Israel were concerned about their peace agreement with Egypt. But when the terms come to Syria, whereas as Dr. Ziyad mentioned, there's a huge interest of the West and the Israeli to weaken the relation between Syria and Iran. We've been hearing a lot of comments about if the Assad regime collapses, Israel going to be in trouble, or the region are going to be in trouble, and that's discouraging lots of countries, and that's pushing lots of Syrians to accuse the Israeli and the American to invest under the table of the Assad regime. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone have any thoughts?
I think that's directed to the Israeli officials, but I can say that maybe at the beginning, the Israeli position, they are some concern about the instability in Syria and what will lead. Now we are hearing some positive reactions from some Israeli officials about that. The main question right now, actually, which the previous panel touched it, is not responsibility to protect, responsibility to prevent. Because in many cases, when you have a possibility of civil war, unfortunately, the international community is only watching. But the international community has responsibility to prevent the civil war rather than managing the civil war later on. It's clear that the Assad regime will not stop the killings, because he knows very well if he stops the killing, we'll have 10 million on the ground protesting against him. And he's investing in the civil war and by continuing the killings. This is why the international community has the responsibility to use all the necessary means to prevent the civil war in Syria, rather than managing the civil war later on, like what's happened in Lebanon. In our neighbor, actually, the international community left the civil war in Lebanon for 15 years, later on trying to manage it in bad way. This is why I think if the international community want to prevent and to save lives, it has to take actions rather than later, sooner rather than later.
I really want to get in at least one more question. I'm sorry, we're really running out of time, real briefly, and then we'll go to closing remarks. Thank you.
We have mentioned quite a lot the GCC. We have hardly spoken about Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, which is certainly not a very enthusiastic supporter of the developments. On the other hand, it would be probably one of the most potential donors. Now, there has been sort of a lot of talk that Europeans might not, but the region might. I have my doubts that countries like Saudi Arabia will really be willing, but I would be very happy to hear more from the panel. Thank you.
Well, I mean, certainly Saudi Arabia perhaps is the most concerned about the developments of the Arab Spring, largely because the empowerment of people against their governments is something that they're very unhappy about. They were obviously very alarmed by what happened in Bahrain, not only because of the risk of people empowerment, but of Iranian potential and the sectarian issue. I think Saudi Arabia is sort of the big risk going forward. There are a number of countries which have not really been hit by the Arab Spring yet. Those include Algeria and Saudi Arabia as two countries which have really resisted. Saudi Arabia has serious succession issues and leadership issues. Saudi Arabia is burying its head in the sand as to the course of history. And Saudi Arabia, if it fails in the next 4 to 5 years, will have huge impacts, not only in the region, but around the world. I agree with you that Saudi Arabia will not enthusiastically finance transitions in the Arab world. That's a problem in itself. What worries me more is that unless Saudi Arabia, like Morocco, like Kuwait, like Jordan, like some others, begins to think seriously of domestic political reform, it itself might be at risk of collapse. Saudi Arabia does not have national unity. It doesn't have functioning political institutions. It has the highest levels of corruption perhaps anywhere in the world. It is a very, very dangerous country moving forward. It is a very close ally. The alliance has gone through troubles, but it's very close to the US. Hence, there needs to be, to my mind, very serious discussions with the current Saudi leadership and whatever leadership emerges after this uncertain succession. Saudi Arabia, in a sense, is too big to fail, but it is going to fail if it doesn't institute significant reforms. And the Arab world will fail if Saudi Arabia and the GCC don't take a vigorous role in economic leadership.
Okay, and we have one more very brief thought right here.
Peter McKay, local. I just want very briefly to ask if you could explore further the options available short of military intervention, because I think this is a critical question for countries, for legislators, enablers. What other options are available short of? I think we have to think outside the box of just the classic sanctions, and thinking about things like banning international competition in events and things like the Olympics, World Cup, etc. This was mentioned previously. But what are the other options available in what we hope is going to be the storm before the calm? I suspect there are going to be many seasons of this Arab spring, summer, fall, for years potentially. And is there another level that we should also think about in terms of sanctions or something short of sanctions against the enablers, those countries who are supportive of dictatorial regimes and those that are maniacal, those that sort of turn a blind eye without naming names, some of them on the Security Council who just sort of shrug their shoulders and say we shouldn't do this.
Wonderful question and very important. We have very little time to explore it. So, gentlemen, let's make this a lightning round of answers. Keep it brief, and these will also be your closing thoughts. So as briefly as possible, starting with Sheikh Abu Salam.
Thank you. I think this is very important, and to us, I'll give you just for Yemen, we need symbolic position to be taken, whether encouraging the UN resolution, Security Council. We look at freezing the assets of the president and his family and his group is something very important. We look at banning him from travel and his associates is very important. And the importation of arms into Yemen that results in the killing of civilian is another essential thing. We don't want, or we do not encourage sanctions against Yemen. And if we get these minimum 3 points, I can assure you, hopefully by this time next year, Saleh will not be in power. And I am optimistic that we will move forward with this change.
Right. Mr. Abulahum, thank you for joining us. Dr. Ziadeh?
Yeah. First, actually, the Syrian crisis shows again how much the Iranian regime are very pragmatic, because he's repeating every time that he said have Islamic principles. But in Ramadan, which actually the holy month in the Islamic calendar, the much higher number have been killed. 5 mosques in Homs and Hama have been destroyed. Would that give you a sense that the Iranian regime more than pragmatic rather than any other regime? Would this is actually disclose all the principles that the Iranian propaganda is repeating? The second issue, actually, the more important for the Syrians is the Security Council to act, because the veto, and we said that to the Russians, empower the regime to kill more. That his field has been protected by superpowers and the Security Council, and they can do whatever. And by repeating that there is no military intervention possible in Syria like in Libya, that the regime is happy to do whatever, because there is no sense of accountability. And all security officers, they have the immunity according to the law. According to the law. And this is why the Security Council have to put a very tough sanctions on Assad and security officers. And this is with cooperation with the Arab League and with Turkey, which is important.
Dr. Ziadeh, thank you. Let's move on. Mr. Kramer.
Very specifically on Syria, I would recognize the Syrian National Council. But beyond that, we underestimate the importance of moral clarity. We were far too late in calling for Assad to step down. We were slow on Mubarak. It's nice that these revolutions are indigenous, but I don't want to see another situation as we saw in Tehran in June of 2009, when protesters were in the streets holding up signs asking Obama, which side are you on? We shouldn't leave in doubt which side we stand on. We stand with the people who are opposing these authoritarian dictatorial regimes that engage in gross human rights abuses. I represent a human rights organization. I worked for 8 years in the State Department. I understand the difficulty of making policy and these decisions. We are guilty of double standards. I know that, and it's important, I think, to admit it and not pretend that we don't engage in double standards. But we really need to be clear when it comes to morals and principles and standards. And if we don't stand for them, then we abandon the people in these countries who are fighting for them.
Mr. Kramer, thank you. And Mr. Salem?
Yeah, I certainly agree that the symbolism recognizing the National Council and those important international steps are critical. For the Syrian case, I think the economy is currently a very critical force in forcing the opinion of some of the middle classes in the urban cities. There, the West doesn't have a huge role, but certainly Turkey, which has a lot of trade still with Syria, has an important decision to make, and they seem to be considering it. The GCC, which has taken an important political decision, also has important business and trade relations with Syria, as does Jordan, as does Lebanon. So perhaps the economy is one dynamic that could regionally be put more into play.
Mr. Salem, thank you. And thank you all, and thank you to our viewers for joining us for this very fascinating discussion, very important discussion of the Arab Spring, which former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger recently described as the first scene of the first act of a 5-act play, which is quite on point. Thank you very much.